The kingdom of Eldenfort stretched across green valleys and high mountains, its castles built of stone and steel. The banners of the crown moved in the wind as soldiers stood guard at the gates of the capital. Inside the great hall, the sound of voices filled the air. Nobles, generals, and council members spoke in worried tones, their faces marked with fear. Queen Alara stood at the front of the hall, her silver robe flowing behind her. She was young but strong, her eyes steady as she listened to the council. The talk was of war. A rival faction of men was rising in the east. They were gathering forces, and soon they would march on the capital. The queen knew her people were not ready. One man spoke loudly, his voice cutting through the noise. He told the queen that there was one name, one figure who could change the course of what was coming. The name hung in the air like a ghost, Daniel Carver. At the sound of the name, the queen froze. Her fingers tightened against the edge of the throne. The hall grew silent as everyone looked at her. No one understood why her face had gone pale, why her lips pressed together as if to hold back words. She did not move. She did not breathe for a moment. The name had struck her deeper than any sword could. Daniel Carver had once been the bravest warrior of Eldenfort. Years ago, he had sworn to protect the crown with his life. He had led armies into battles that seemed unwinnable, and had returned each time with victory. But one day on the Black Plains, when the rival men struck with fire and iron, Daniel had vanished. Many thought he had died, others whispered he had deserted. But Alara had never spoken of him, never allowed his name to be said in her presence, until now. The council did not notice the tremble in her hand. They only spoke of rumors, of banners seen at the border, of soldiers who claimed to follow the lost warrior. Some said he had returned, leading men who had remained loyal to him. Others said impostors used his name to inspire fear. Lara listened, but her mind was far away. Remembered the last time she had seen him. The night before the battle, when he had knelt before her throne and promised that no harm would come to her as long as he lived. She had believed him. But the dawn had brought fire, and by sunset he was gone. She had told herself he was dead. It was easier than hoping. Now, as the name echoed in her ears, she felt the weight of memory. She wanted to believe he lived, but she feared the pain that came with such hope. If he had lived, why had he not returned sooner? Why had he left her to rule alone, to face betrayal and doubt without his steady hand? The hall grew louder as the generals argued. Some demanded that the queen dismiss the rumors. Others begged her to seek the warrior out. Alara raised her hand, and silence fell again. Her voice was calm, though inside she felt a storm. She told them they would prepare for war. The kingdom would not wait for myths or shadows. The men of Eldenfort would stand and fight. But when she sat alone that night in her chamber, the queen could not forget the sound of the name. The candlelight flickered across her face as she whispered it softly, as if afraid to wake the past. Daniel Carver. The man she had trusted above all, the man whose loss had shaped her reign. Her heart told her he lived. Her mind told her it was impossible. She stared out at the dark sky beyond her window, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder if the warrior might one day return. The queen could not sleep that night. The name of Daniel Carver still echoed in her thoughts. She walked alone through the halls of the castle, her steps soft against the stone. The torches lit her path, but her mind was far away, lost in memories she had tried to bury for years. She remembered Daniel as he had been, strong, fearless, yet always gentle in his manner. He never boasted of his victories, carried his sword with discipline, not pride. To the people, he was a hero. To her, he had been more than that. He was the man who stood by her side when she first took the crown, the man who told her she was not alone, even when the burden felt too heavy. When he vanished, many believed he had fallen on the battlefield. Some whispered darker things, that he had betrayed the crown, that he had abandoned his oath. Alara never spoke against them, but in her heart, she never believed he would betray her. She only told herself he was gone forever, for it was easier than living with doubt. Now, with rumors spreading across the land, she felt that doubt rise again. Could it truly be him? Could Daniel have survived? If he lived, why had he stayed away? These questions weighed on her more than the fear of war itself. The next morning, a messenger arrived at the gates. He was wounded and tired, his clothes torn from travel. The guards brought him before the queen. The man bowed and told her he came from the borderlands. His voice shook as he spoke of banners carried by riders in the night. The banners bore a single mark, the same mark Daniel had carried into battle years ago. The council gathered again, and the hall filled with noise. Some called it a trick, a lie made to divide the kingdom. Others said it was a sign that the warrior had returned. Ilara listened without showing her heart, but inside she felt her chest tighten. She asked the messenger what else he had seen. The man spoke of soldiers who followed this leader. They fought with discipline, as if trained by the same hand that once guarded the crown. They did not raid or steal. They protected villages from the rival faction. The people called their leader the Lost Warrior. Ilara dismissed the hall and returned to her chamber. She sat at her desk and opened a locked chest. Inside were letters written in Daniel's hand. She had kept them hidden all these years. The words were simple, full of loyalty and duty. In one letter he wrote that if the kingdom ever fell into great danger, he would return, even if it cost him his life. She had once believed those words, but time had worn them thin. As she read the letters again, her eyes filled with tears. She did not want to be the queen who clung to ghosts, yet she could not ignore what the messenger had seen. If Daniel truly lived, then fate had brought him back when the kingdom needed him most. That night, Ilara walked to the balcony of her chamber. The city below was quiet, though soldiers kept watch on the walls. She looked out at the mountains, where the enemy gathered their strength. Somewhere beyond those peaks, perhaps Daniel marched with his men. She whispered his name to the wind. She remembered his promise, the way he had looked at her with steady eyes before the battle that took him away. She remembered the way her heart had broken when he did not return. Now she feared that seeing him again would break it all over, yet she also knew the truth. If he had returned, if Daniel Carver still lived, then the future of the kingdom would change forever. The castle of Eldenfort was never quiet in days of war. The sound of steel rang through the courtyards as soldiers trained from dawn until night. Horses filled the stables, ready for the long march. Banners were stitched and sharpened. Spears leaned against the walls. The kingdom was preparing for the fight that was coming closer with every passing day. Queen Ilara watched from the balcony as her men drilled in the yard. She could see the sweat on their faces, the strength in their arms, but also the fear in their eyes. They were loyal, yet she knew many of them whispered about the old warrior. They wondered if Daniel Carver had truly returned. Some said his name with hope, others with doubt. In the evenings, she would walk through the camps, speaking to the captains and hearing their worries. They all asked the same question without saying it aloud. Would Daniel come back to lead them? Ilara gave no answer. Her voice was calm, her words steady, but her heart was in turmoil. One night, as the fires burned low, a hooded man entered the camp. The guards stopped him, but he asked for the queen by name. His voice was low and steady, carrying the weight of memory. Ilara came forward, her hand on the hilt of her sword, though she rarely carried it. The man knelt before her. When he raised his head, the firelight revealed a face worn by years of battle, marked with scars but strong. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. The eyes staring back at her were the same eyes she remembered, the same eyes that had once promised her safety. It was Daniel. For a moment she could not speak. The world seemed to still around them. Soldiers stared in disbelief, whispering his name as if afraid to break the silence. Daniel bowed his head, his voice calm as he said he had returned. He told her he had never broken his oath. He had lived in exile, gathering men who still believed in honor, waiting for the day when the kingdom would need him. Ilara's hands trembled, but she kept her face steady. She asked him why he had not returned sooner. He explained that he had been hunted, forced into hiding, and could not reveal himself until the right time. Many of his men had died for this cause, but they had held true to their vow. The queen listened, her heart torn between joy and anger. She wanted to embrace him, but she also wanted to demand why he had left her to rule alone. She could not show weakness before her men, so she asked for proof of his loyalty. She told him that words were not enough. If he wished to stand at her side again, he would need to show it in battle. Daniel accepted without question. He said he would fight not for his name but for the people of Eldenfort. He asked only that she trust him once more. That night Ilara walked back to her chamber with heavy steps. She knew she had seen the truth in his eyes. This was no imposter. It was Daniel. returned from the shadows of the past, yet she feared what his presence would bring. His return would give hope to her people, but it could also tear open old wounds that had never healed. As the dawn broke, the kingdom readied itself again. Drums echoed across the fields. Men stood taller, their voices louder. News had already spread through the ranks. The lost warrior had returned. The queen did not confirm it, but she did not deny it either. She only stood at the head of her army, her face calm as stone, though her heart was in turmoil. She knew that the days ahead would test them all. She knew that the enemy was close, and soon the kingdom would burn if they failed. But now, standing somewhere among her soldiers, was Daniel Carver, the man whose name had once shaken her to silence. And this time, the queen swore to herself she would not let the past decide the future. The day of battle came with dark skies. Clouds hung heavy over the mountains as the rival army marched toward Eldenfort. Their banners of black and silver rose above the horizon like a storm. The sound of drums carried across the fields, steady and cold. Queen Alara rode to the front of her army. She wore armor of polished steel, her crown replaced by a simple helm. She did not hide behind the walls of the castle. She stood where her soldiers could see her, where they would know she was ready to fight beside them. The men raised their swords and spears, their voices rising in a roar that shook the air. Among them rode Daniel Carver. His presence gave strength to the soldiers. They looked at him with awe, as if a legend had stepped out of the past. He gave no grand speech. He only spoke a few words, steady and clear, telling them to hold the line, to trust in one another, and to fight for the kingdom they called home. When the armies met, the earth trembled. Steel clashed against steel, shields broke, and arrows darkened the sky. The rival men fought with fury, but Daniel led his strike force with skill. He moved like he had never been gone, his sword finding its mark, his voice carrying over the chaos, guiding his men through the storm. Alara fought at the front, her blade flashing as she stood with her guard. She was not just a ruler that day, she was a soldier. She struck down enemies who came too close, her resolve as sharp as her sword. Her men saw her courage and fought harder, unwilling to fail their queen. The battle stretched into the afternoon. Fires burned across the field, smoke rising into the dark sky. Daniel pressed forward, his men breaking through enemy lines. At last he faced the rival warlord, a towering figure in black armor. The duel drew every eye, for it was clear that the outcome would decide the fight. The two clashed in the center of the field, swords striking with force that rang like thunder. The warlord was strong, but Daniel was steady, his strikes clean and measured. The fight was long, and blood stained the ground, but at last Daniel struck the warlord down. His sword hovered above the fallen man, ready to deliver the final blow. Soldiers of Eldenfort shouted for him to end it, but Alara raised her hand. Her voice cut through the chaos. She commanded that the man be spared. Daniel paused, his chest rising with heavy breath. For a moment, the years of exile and war weighed on him. Then he lowered his sword and stepped back. He obeyed her command without question. The rival men saw their leader spared, and their strength faltered. Many dropped their weapons, surrendering in fear and respect. The battlefield grew still as the tide of war shifted. The enemy was broken, not by death, but by mercy. When the sun set, the field was covered with the scars of battle. Fires burned low and the wounded were carried back to camp. Alara stood among her soldiers, her face marked with dirt and blood, but her eyes clear. She knew victory had been won, yet she also knew it had been more than a battle. It had been a test of trust, of loyalty, and of the bond between her and Daniel. That night the camp was filled with cheers, but Alara sat alone in her tent. Daniel entered quietly, his armor dented and his sword at his side. He bowed before her, but she told him to rise. For a long moment they looked at one another, the silence heavy with all that had been left unsaid for years. He had returned, not with words but with actions. On the field he had proven his loyalty again, and though her heart still carried scars, she felt a strength in knowing that together they had saved the kingdom. Outside, the men celebrated. Inside, the queen and the warrior stood in silence, bound not by the past, but by what they had fought to protect. The war was over, but the kingdom was not quiet. The fields outside the city still carried the smell of smoke and blood. Broken weapons lay scattered, and the wounded filled the tents. Yet hope was alive. Yet the people of Eldenfort knew they had survived, because their queen had stood with them, and because the warrior they thought lost had returned. Queen Alara walked through the streets of the capital the next morning. The people bowed as she passed, their voices rising in praise. They called her strong, they called her brave, but many also whispered the name of Daniel Carver. His return had become a story carried from village to village, a tale of loyalty that gave new life to the people. Daniel did not walk among the cheers. He stayed with the soldiers, helping the wounded, speaking with those who had lost family. He did not claim glory. He said nothing of his own deeds. He only spoke of the courage of the men who had fought beside him and the wisdom of the queen who had spared the rival warlord. When night came, Alara sat in the great hall once more. The council praised her victory, though some still looked at Daniel with doubt. They feared his strength, feared that his name could rise above the crown. Lara listened, but said nothing. She knew the truth of his heart. She had seen it on the field when he had lowered his sword at her command. Later, when the hall was empty, Daniel came to her. He stood at the foot of the throne, silent at first. The candles flickered between them. He told her he did not return to seek power or title. He returned only to fulfill his oath, the oath he made years ago, when he promised he would never leave her unguarded. Alara rose from her throne and stepped toward him. Her eyes softened, though her voice was steady. She told him that the kingdom had waited for him, that his absence had been a wound that never healed. Yet now he stood before her and the wound no longer bled. For a long moment they said nothing. Silence between them spoke more than words could. She remembered the night he had vanished, remembered the promise he had made. Both knew that the bond they once shared had not been broken by time. The days that followed were filled with rebuilding. Villages were restored, the walls of the city repaired, and the farms replanted. Alara ruled with steady hands, but Daniel was always near, not as a shadow, but as a shield. The people saw them together and believed that the kingdom had entered a new age of strength. One evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Alara and Daniel stood on the balcony of the castle. The sky was painted in red and gold, and the sound of the city rose below them. She told him that when she first heard his name in the hall, she had been frozen with shock. He could not move because the weight of memory was too heavy. Now she understood why. His name was more than a memory. It was a promise that had survived even the darkest years. Daniel did not answer at once. He only placed his hand over his heart and bowed his head. Then he told her that he would stand by her until his last breath. Alara looked out at her kingdom, scarred but alive. She knew there would be more trials ahead, more enemies to face, more storms to endure. But she also knew she was no longer alone. The warrior who had once been lost had returned, and together they would carry the burden of the crown. The night grew quiet, the city lights glowing like stars below. Queen and warrior stood side by side, not speaking, not moving, held in the silence of truth. And in that silence both found peace.